In the early 1850s, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a story about two families torn apart by slavery. With biting irony, she detailed the life of a man named Tom who lived in relative comfort under his slave master, Shelby. Shelby promised Tom his freedom because Tom was a good, devout Christian man. But the moment Shelby's property came into danger because of debt, Shelby sold Tom to a slave trader. While on the slave market, Tom saved the life of a young girl and was purchased by her family. Once again, he was under the care of what some might consider to be a benign slave owner, and yet again, Tom was offered his freedom only to have it snatched away when his new owner was stabbed to death. Sold yet again, this time to cruel owners, Tom was relentlessly beaten when he refused to whip another slave. His owners vowed to make him turn his back on Christianity. Tom nevertheless persevered. He helped two sex slaves escape and was rewarded by being beaten nearly to death. The child of his original master returned at the last moment to try and free Tom, but he was too late. With his dying breath, Tom forgave his tormentors and died a Christian martyr. In honor of Tom, all of the slaves belonging to his original master were set free. The newly freed slaves were then encouraged to think of Tom's sacrifice whenever they looked upon Uncle Tom's cabin. In the 1850s, racism and slavery were a topic of hot debate as people tried to espouse the concept of benign slave owners who were kind and loving toward their slaves. Harriet Beecher Stowe debunked that idea using her story Uncle Tom's Cabin to highlight the true devastation of the slaves as a result of the actions of kind masters who tore families apart for their own personal benefit. She did this by changing the angle from which stories about slaves were told away from the perspective of the masters who thought themselves righteous to the perspective of the slaves who suffered abuse either directly at the hands of their masters or at the hands of whoever was next in line to control their fate. Harriet Beecher Stowe changed the world by telling what was then a familiar story from a different angle. She was the first person to ever represent slaves as mothers, fathers, children, and friends. The first one to represent slaves as people. Just over a decade after the publication of her work, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed amid the turmoil of the Civil War. Telling a story from a new angle can change everything. Welcome to CC Writes. My name is CC Lepke, and today we're taking our stories to the 90th degree. That's a right angle. If someone asked you to write the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops, how would you tell it? The original work, part of Homer's Odyssey, was told from the perspective of a ship captain in ancient Greece who found himself captured by the Cyclops after stealing its food. But in 2000, the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou tells the same tale through the perspective of an escaped convict who runs afoul of a one-eyed con man. The movie Warm Bodies retells Romeo and Juliet from the lens of a zombie who falls in love with the human daughter of a zombie resistance army. Easy A rehashes the territory of The Scarlet Letter, She's the Man, 10 Things I Hate About You. So many stories that we consume are just old tales rewritten. In my last video, where I went through an episode of The Simpsons to show how it was made, I mentioned that the story being told wasn't necessarily breaking new ground. The originality of the story came from its fresh angle on an old story trope. You've probably heard the expression that there's no such thing as a new story. After millennia of humans existing in this world, sharing stories and rehashing well-loved ideas, it is extremely difficult to find a story that hasn't already been told in some form or another. That's why it's so important for writers to learn how to tell a well-worn story from a new angle. When it comes to creativity, it isn't always about what story you tell. It's about how you tell it. I can't guarantee that finding a good angle for your story will ensure your tale will have a lasting societal impact like Harriet Beecher Stowe. What I can tell you is that you can breathe new life into your story with a simple change of perspective. If you've been racking your brain trying to find a story no one has ever heard before, then save yourself the headache and just keep watching. Because the best stories aren't necessarily new. It's like music sampling, a reboot, plagiarism light. There are a lot of tools you can use to create a story with a new angle, but I want to keep things simple by focusing on 3 of the ones I find most useful: the era swap, the perspective change, and the untold perspective. Using these 3 tools to reimagine your story will take your idea from a common trope to a fresh new concept in no time at all. How well you execute that fresh idea is up to you, but at least you'll start your story off on the right track. The era swap tool is a method for retelling well-known stories. It's along the lines of what happened with O Brother, Where Art Thou? They took the story from an era of heroes in ancient Greece to a time during the Great Depression in America. Roles were changed to fit the new setting. Odysseus the king, known for his guile and adaptability, became fast-talking Everett, the convict who was sentenced to work on a chain gang for practicing law without a license. Most of the time, the era swap is used to take an old classic and present it to a more modern audience. You can change the era, the setting, and even the genre of the work. The Lunar Chronicles, for instance, take classic fairy tales and places them in a futuristic sci-fi setting. It's the ultimate game of what if. What if Cinderella was a cyborg? What if Snow White lived on the moon? What if Rapunzel was a hacker who lived in a satellite? The perspective change is yet another tool used to update classic stories. You take a well-loved story and then you switch the character that tells the story. Usually it's retold through the villain's perspective. A classic case of this is in the video game Braid, which takes the trope of a man trying to rescue a princess from a monster and turns it on its head when it's revealed that the main character is actually the villain who has been stalking and harassing the princess throughout the course of the game. Another classic story with an example of a perspective change is Wicked, which shares tales from the land of Oz from the perspective of the witches. Retelling a story this way can change the entire perspective of the original story, giving the overall tale much more depth. The era swap is a thought exercise, but the perspective change is an exercise in 3-dimensional character design. It takes a flat, often demonized character and forces an audience to see them in a new, typically more sympathetic light. The untold perspective may or may not make use of classic stories, but the primary focus is to tell a commonly understood story or trope from an unexpected new lens. If you use a fairy tale or trope, you tell the story from the perspective of an often underlooked side character, and then give that character a much larger role in the world than they previously held. Harriet Beecher Stowe's story was about slavery in the South, but told from the perspective of slaves, which had never been done before. Until that point in time, no one thought to even care about a slave's perspective. So tell your stories through the eyes of common, everyday background characters, the underprivileged, the untalented, uneducated, and seemingly unworthy, because you'll quickly find out those perspectives are worth a lot more than you give them credit for. But don't just take my word for it. Let's put it to the test. I'll come up with 3 story ideas using these methods, and we'll see if their story's worth telling. For era swap, I'll use Beowulf as the basis. For perspective change, we'll use Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And for untold perspective, I'll use the ugly person gets a glow up trope. Let's see what I can come up with. For each section, I took the original story and asked a few key questions about it. What are the best known story elements? What era is it set? Whose perspective was it written in? Who are the well-known characters and who are the unknown characters? Once I had that under wraps, I could quickly spitball ideas by asking myself what-if questions. For the first story, using the era swap method, I asked myself, what if Beowulf was a pro wrestler from the 80s? The perspective change story had me redefining the role of the Queen of Hearts and Alice, respectively. The last story, where I reinterpreted a classic trope based on an unknown perspective, I investigated all of the unknown people who could have an impact on the story. Let me show you what I came up with. What if Beowulf was a pro wrestler in the 80s and Grendel the monster was his heel? Beowulf breaks Grendel's arm during a fight and he later dies in the hospital during a surgery. Grendel's mom, overcome with grief, goes to the wrestling arena with a gun and accidentally shoots another wrestler. She runs away and Beowulf goes after her to try and make things right, but she threatens him with the gun. He tries to get away, they struggle, and she ends up getting shot as well. He goes on to become one of the most well-loved wrestlers of all time, but lives the rest of his life in grief for the lives that were lost because of him. The Queen of Hearts rules over the dreamlike world of Wonderland, where imagination changes the environment and the denizens on a regular basis. Often, Wonderland is invaded by dreamers whose wild imaginations wreak havoc on the land. A young child dreamer comes to Wonderland, and her unbound imagination sends dangerous ripples across the kingdom. The Queen of Hearts has to find a way to wake the child up before all of Wonderland is changed for good, or worse, if the child's dream becomes a nightmare that none of them can escape. A young man is in love with his childhood friend that is greatly mistreated by her family. He works hard to become a carriage driver for the king, earning money so he can buy a home and ask her to run away with him, despite the fact that she's of a different socioeconomic status than him. One night, his friend comes to him decked out and begs him to take her to a ball thrown by the prince. He agrees. That night, she meets the prince and falls deeply in love, but has to run away at the last minute to get home before her family, who didn't want her there in the first place. Her family discovers her treachery and treats her worse than ever. Now, the only thing the young man can do is try to get the fickle prince to return her affections to rescue her from her brutal family, giving up on the love of his life in order to save her from her cruel fate. I'll be honest, my favorite story is the one with Beowulf, but I'm a tragedy writer, so I might be a bit biased on that front. Tell me which story is your favorite in the comments, or tell me what stories you came up with using the same prompts. If you enjoyed these brainstorming methods and want to see more, check out the video on top where I show you other fun ways to brainstorm a story. Otherwise, click on the bottom video to see what YouTube recommends. As always, thank you so much for joining me today on CC Writes. I hope you enjoyed our time together, and I will see you later.